England's villages. Thatched cottages, neatly tended gardens. The village shop, the church, teas on the lawn. It's a cosy chocolate box image recognised across the globe. I'm Ben Robinson, and as an archaeologist, I'm fascinated by the places where we live and how they've developed throughout history.
For me, the story of our villages from the Normans to the present day is not one of sleepy rural idylls. It's a story of purpose and power.
One of the last places you might expect to find a village is in the sprawling capital, and yet here they are. London evolved from villages, and over the last century and a half, Londoners have fought to preserve them and shape their future. Out of conflict and change, a new kind of settlement has been born, the urban village. This lonely tower is all that remains of the Church of St Mary, which once stood at the heart of the village of Hornsey, in the old rural county of Middlesex. Hornsey was originally settled in Anglo-Saxon times, and a church was first recorded here in the 13th century. For centuries, this whole area was rural. Lots of woodland and later pasture and meadowland. Now, as you can see, old Hornsey village is submerged beneath the sprawl of North London. This tiny village green is one of the few traces of the large tract of common land that used to run along what's now Hornsey High Street. Villagers would have had traditional grazing and gathering rights on it until the early 19th century, when it was enclosed and parcelled up into private country estates for wealthy London merchants. But as well as shifts in social power, there are also major technological developments that change the character of villages like this.
In 1850, the Great Northern Railway Company decided that Hornsey would be the site of its first station on its new line from King's Cross to the north.
With the opportunities it now offered for commuting, Hornsey became popular with city workers who wanted to live away from the noise and pollution. From the 1870s, the urbanisation of the area gathered pace. The country estates were sold off to developers as their owners died.
As a sign of how drastically this once bucolic village had changed, take a look at this, an old gin palace built in 1897, and it was built to serve the residents in all these surrounding terraced streets.
Hornsey's population expanded from fewer than 3,000 in 1801 to over 85,000 a century later. And as it was urbanised, social divisions were reinforced through different types of housing. To find out more about the late Victorian construction of Hornsey, I'm meeting Peter Barber, president of the Hornsey Historical Society.
I can't sort of hardly make out Hornsey here at all.
Exactly.
I've got the name, but it's very difficult to find the old village in this. There are rows and rows and rows of terrace houses nearby. This is pretty intensively developed now, isn't it?
It is indeed, and where you get the railway going, you don't expect high property values. So the houses are crammed together on the ladder, and this is very much, if you like, the working class district of Hornsey. It's full of clerks and so on, but if you go up the hill, the development is much less dense, because this is the area where the church commissioners wanted to get the money from the sale of leases.
The Church of England was one of the main landowners and keen to profit from Hornsey's development.
The church commissioners were dominated by businessmen. They wanted something that was upper class so that it would bring more revenues into the church. So yes, there's urbanisation, but it's a very, very carefully planned urbanisation, meant only for the right sort of people.
I love the change in the names as well. I couldn't help but notice Churchyard Bottomwood becomes Queenswood, gravel pit wood becomes Highgate Woods. So actually in the names as well, there's a sort of gentrification in the names going on.
Absolutely. And things do become very much more genteel. And it's a successful strategy. It brings in the right sort of tenants, and the tenants eventually become owners.
London's population swelled during the Victorian period from around 2 million to 6.5 million. With its rail network expanding and new underground lines opening, many other villages from Hammersmith to Blackheath were swallowed up by the hungry metropolis. But the 19th century wasn't simply a story of unchecked growth and rapid change.
The Victorian era also produced a reaction against this urbanisation, the beginnings of a modern conservation movement. One of the first great battles would be fought by the residents of one of London's most famous and celebrated historic villages.
The old hilltop farm village of Hampstead, meaning homestead, was transformed into a fashionable spa resort in the early 18th century after a mineral spring was discovered here. By the mid-19th century, Hampstead was a desirable residential district for affluent Londoners, and the large expanse of common land bordering the village had become a hugely valuable asset.
Hampstead's fortunes have always been closely entwined with those of its famous heath. The heath protects the village from London's urban sprawl. But both village and heath only exist as they do today because the residents of Hampstead fought tooth and claw against the lord of the manor, who wanted to develop the heath for housing.
The absentee landlord of Hampstead Manor was Sir Thomas Marion Wilson, who first decided he wanted to build on parts of the heath back in the 1820s. This set him on a collision course with the commoners, village residents who leased land from him. Helen Lawrence is the author of a forthcoming book on the fight to save Hampstead Heath.
The commoners were just concerned about their rights. They'd bought quite expensively their leases, as it were, from Marion Wilson, and they were very indignant that he appeared to want to sort of encourage them to build and so on, and that's not what they'd bought these leases for. They'd bought them because it was still a little bit of open country on the edge of the city. If the Hampstead commoners had been greedy, they could easily have sided with Sir Thomas Marion Wilson and got together and agreed to allow Hampstead Heath to be built on. And people, you know, they didn't do that. They thought, no, we've got to keep this. I think one of the things he miscalculated was that most of these battles over enclosures of land were with small farmers. I think he just didn't understand that Hampstead wasn't like that. Hampstead was now full of people, probably some of them as wealthy as he was, and they weren't going to be trampled over.
So Hampstead becomes this battleground, the ancient manorial rights versus the interests of the tenants, of the villagers.
Yeah. The first commoners who opposed him did it purely on their rights and their properties, and they didn't want their properties to be devalued. But because of the Industrial Revolution and the slums developing in towns, you had this new cadre of people rising up who were definitely philanthropists and public-spirited and felt that poor people needed somewhere to be able to go and you must preserve these open spaces. And the whole conversation got widened out in particular from Prince Leopold, who was the youngest son of Queen Victoria, right down to the shopkeepers in Hampstead.
At the end of the day, it comes down to people, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly.
People power, but also people's will to change things.
Exactly.
From the 1820s through to the 1860s, Sir Thomas tried to get an act through Parliament giving him rights to develop the heath. But MPs, with the backing of campaigners, the press and Hampstead's commoners, thwarted him time and time again.
He just carried on as if nothing had happened. No, I don't concede that anyone has a right to this land. It's my land, blah, blah. You know, he just did not accept anything.
But he had centuries of sort of manorial history
That's
and
right.
rights behind
That's
him,
right.
and he was on the crest of this great sort of social wave
That's
that
right.
he doesn't seem to be picking up on
He
at
just didn't pick up on it.
And Sir Thomas was swimming against the tide. The Metropolitan Commons Act was passed in 1866, preventing the enclosure of common land within a radius of 15 miles from Charing Cross. Sir Thomas himself died in 1869, and 2 years later, his heir sold the heath to a forerunner of the Greater London Council. A further act was passed guaranteeing that the heath would remain permanently open for public use.
There's scarcely a parliamentary debate or a press report about open spaces throughout that period that doesn't mention Hampstead Heath. It was the sort of the icon of the whole thing. Even though Epping and Wimbledon and all these other places were equally under threat, Hampstead was the thing.
Helen is also a former vice president of the Heath and Hampstead Society, which had its origins in the 19th century struggles to save the heath.
After the first few decades of the 20th century, they began to realise that with London expanding and so much building going on, they needed to monitor what was being built in order to protect the heath. They didn't want huge blocks of flats surrounding it. And from then, they got more and more interested in the village itself. The societies had a huge role in saving it and refurbishing it and looking after it and making it accessible to the local residents. It's a very fine record. They've had a programme to renew all the beautiful Edwardian or older lamp posts. They've refurbished the original well of the Spa, and Berg House, just up the road from here, was also saved by the Heath and Hampstead Society people. The other threat that was ongoing from as early as the 1920s was roads. They were always wanting to widen Heath Street, which would have meant literally just knocking it down to make it wider. It culminated in the Bressie report in the 1930s, which would have knocked down half of Hampstead, and there was supposed to be a flyover which would have come across here somehow and landed in Heath Street. It's a sort of nightmare scenario, and you think to yourself, how on earth could they have even thought of it?
But while the forces of conservation won the day in Hampstead and have continued to preserve the historic fabric of the old village, other parts of the capital were not so fortunate.
By the early 20th century, with its population still growing, London's housing needs were immense. And for some local authorities, preserving the heritage of areas was not a big priority. In the early 1900s, Dagenham was a rural village in Essex.
At first glance, old Dagenham looks like the classic English village. There's the church with medieval origins, the pub, the village green.
In fact, the green is less than 20 years old, created after all of the old cottages that once stood here were demolished in the 1960s. Today, the church and the pub are completely hemmed in by modern social housing. The old village has been almost completely destroyed. Dagenham's rural character began to change after the First World War, when there was an urgent need to house EastEnders displaced by slum clearances. London County Council compulsorily purchased 3,000 acres of farmland near Dagenham to build Becontree. By the 30s, it was the world's largest public housing estate. Rosemary Rogers spent her childhood years in old Dagenham village after the Second World War.
That is how it was in the 1950s. There was Mrs. Old, the hairdressers, Mr. Parker of the butchers, Collins cottages, that was the almshouses. There was a co-op a baker's where the bread was baked on the premises, just about one of everything you would need. Everybody knew everybody else and people were all very friendly in the village. I think that was the wartime spirit, but it really was a happy community.
So post-war, things are starting to change,
Yes.
there's new developments happening, and the village is changing almost overnight.
Well, it had to cater for more people.
Following the wartime blitz, more and more East End families relocated to the Becontree estate. Their relations with Dagenham's villagers were not always harmonious.
When we went home at night, we went into our village area, and if any of the children from the estate came, we'd chase them off with winter warmers.
You'll have to explain what a winter warmer
A
is.
winter warmer was a Tate & Lyle's syrup tin, which we put holes in the lid. We put twigs and leaves and anything that would burn in the tin, set it alight. We had the tin on a chain and we whirled it round our head. So the smoke came out all over the place. And we just chased them off with our winter warmers.
Sounds a bit dangerous. Sounds like you're really protective of the village there.
We were protective of the village, but the next day we'd be playing in the playground.
Would you ever go to their patch?
Oh, no. No, we didn't go to their patch. No. They used to have sing-songs, and they used to sing songs that we didn't know, and words we didn't understand. Their rhyming slang we didn't understand.
You'd been growing up there and generations of the same family being there, and all of a sudden there's you're surrounded by these incomers.
We had the tradition of being in the village. We had the village stream, we played around there, and we didn't want to share it with anybody else. That was our village.
But as the area around it developed, Dagenham village lost its position as the centre of the community. By the early 1960s, with many of its old buildings falling into decay, the village's days were numbered.
The village was demolished in about a week.
What did that feel like for you, someone who'd grown up there?
I think the feeling everybody had was one of dismay, because it was part of our heritage, had been there hundreds of years, and just to see it demolished, it was heartbreaking. When the village was demolished, we lost our identity. The house I lived in, that was demolished as well, so I had to move out. But I've always been back. All my friends and all my time is still spent in Dagenham. My heart is in Dagenham. I've never left.
Old Dagenham village was destroyed just as public attitudes towards historic buildings were shifting decisively towards preservation.
There was a public outcry when the Euston Arch was demolished in 1961, and again the following year when the London Coal Exchange was knocked down. There was a growing resistance to historic buildings being destroyed in the name of progress. St Pancras was saved after fierce campaigning, and in 1967 new legislation was passed allowing local authorities across the country to create conservation areas.
This is the historic centre of Walthamstow in East London. It was one of the very first conservation areas in the capital, designated in 1967, just as the legislation was passed. And this conservation area retains a wonderful selection of historic village buildings, spanning around 900 years of history.
As well as many grand houses, there's the 12th century parish church, the 15th century ancient house, and rows of Georgian almshouses. In mid-Victorian times, Walthamstow's centre shifted to nearby Orford Road, which acquired an impressive range of public buildings and has also been granted its own conservation area status. Emily G is the London Planning Director for Historic England.
Sitting here today, I don't feel like I'm in the centre of London. I don't feel like I'm a big, sprawling, urban mass of housing. I feel like I'm in a village.
Yes, and you are. I mean, we are in a historic place. It is very preserved as a central core. You can still read the medieval landscape here with the church and the manor house, and all the surrounding sense of character is very much remaining. And conservation area designation is a huge part of that. I mean, a lot of those buildings obviously be individually listed as well, and that's a very important way of protecting architectural character. But the conservation area as a way of managing the place in a very positive way is what helps to sort of retain that very village and historic character.
And how many conservation areas are there now in London?
Well, in London, I think there are just over 1,000, about 1,026, and that's about 10% of the national total. Each of them is special, and it's a way of reflecting the character of that place. People feel good in places that have a sense of the past. You know, that idea that you can read the original landscape, even in the middle of an urban area, and get a sense of what came before, I think makes everyone feel more connected to a place.
Conserving the built environment is an important way of keeping London's village past alive. But for many modern-day Londoners to feel like villagers, it's about communities coming together to take ownership, to create new identities for themselves and establish a new breed of urban villages.
The former farming village of Crouch End has built up a reputation in recent years as one of London's archetypal urban villages. It holds an annual community festival, now in its 7th year.
You've got to go 15 minutes that way, 15 minutes behind, or 15 minutes that way to get to an actual tube station. So I think that's what's kept its villagey feel.
Crouch End is all about the community, all about seeing the same person walk by in the street and raising your hand and saying hello.
I grew up in a village out in the actual countryside, but a place like Crouch End has that place where you recognise people on the street time and time again that you don't normally get in other parts of London.
Since at least Norman times, many English villages have been shaped and controlled by powerful elites, lords, clergymen, industrialists. Now power seems to be shifting towards communities.
Zina Al-Kayat is the author of a recent book on London's villages.
There's a festival going on here at Crouch End. People are getting to sort of gather. Is it that sort of thing that's fostering this sense of community and being in a village?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the people that create the farmers market. It's the people that set up a local choir or a pub quiz or an arts festival or a jumble trail. Those are the things that help people feel pride and ownership over their local area. It's something that we've lost historically, this idea of community, and it is emerging again, that we are kind of seeing the value and benefits of being connected to the people around us, to know our neighbours, to meet people in the pub, to have the guy who kind of sells you coffee each morning know your name or know what you want to order. That level of connection is of real value to people who live in an urban environment where you can feel kind of isolated or slightly faceless or a bit overwhelmed by the size and scale of a city.
The urban village concept that Crouch End typifies is now ubiquitous in London, from Stoke Newington to Dulwich and Chiswick. And yes, it's about communities shaping their own identity. But is it also about estate agents selling an upwardly mobile, aspirational lifestyle? All the convenience of modern urban living, but with a village vibe.
And if the village label has become a marketing tool, is it one that's now in danger of being overused? This area of South Clapham, centred round a short Victorian shopping parade, is known as Aberville Village. But it's only been called this since the late 1990s. Since then, house prices have rocketed and smart shops and restaurants have sprung up.
They must have started calling the village, well, in recent times. I used to live in here about 1948. It wasn't a village then.
Kat Hanna is a specialist in urban planning.
I mean, there's no doubt that we do see the word village used quite a lot in marketing. And again, I think cynically you could say, yes, that's actually just about maybe attracting a certain type of people or demographic, perhaps particularly, families on a relatively good income. There's no doubt that house prices in somewhere like Abbeyville are quite high and I think, prohibitive to a lot of people, particularly those, who are younger. But there's, I think, a question then of, well, actually, if areas like Abbeyville and this, this village life are quite so popular, are there principles of that actually could be adopted either in newer developments or in existing parts of London as well?
With so many different areas of London now branding themselves as urban villages, it begs the question, can a village really be created from scratch?
I've come to the East Village, the former athletes' accommodation in Stratford's Olympic Park. The village, built on a rejuvenated brownfield site, is now home to around 6,000 residents. Kath Scanlon is a research fellow at LSE London and the author of a report identifying the key features of successful urban villages.
This place feels very different to the traditional village, but according to your indicators, actually it's pretty similar.
Well, it has a lot of the characteristics that we've identified as the core of urban villages. It's designed to encourage social interaction. It's an area that you can know well on foot. It's got local shops and services, and it's got excellent transport links.
But the East Village is almost exclusively a rental village, owned by its developers.
A true village is locally driven and locally responsive. The people who live in it have control over the destiny of the place. Now that is going to be a challenge in any new community like this, where all of the homes are rented. We tend to think of owner-occupiers, people who own their homes, as forming the backbone of many communities because they have a long-term stake in a place, roots in a particular bit of soil. Now, that's not the case here, but it's early days. It's only been occupied for 4 years, and the landlord's hope is that people will put down roots and will stay.
That's another important ingredient of a village, isn't it? It's this heritage, it's tradition, it's people having a stake in the place over a long period of time.
Absolutely. What we hope is that the lessons that we've learned from looking at historic villages and at some of the pioneering modern villages can ensure that what we're building now is fit for not just this year and next year, but for the next 100 years.
In London, which of course is made up of a wonderful mix of people moving in and out all the time, new communities, they can really build a new shared identity around a place where, perhaps no one has historically been there for very long, but there's a sense that actually together they own that place if it has really good quality public realm and a sense of connection with the ground that sits beneath.
I think villages provide an enduring expression of deep human needs, a sense of community, a sense of identity. And the story of the village continues to unfold. What are they for? Who are they for? One thing's for certain, these precious places continue to evolve.